Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Enlightening Your Way. I am your host, Nancy Lombardo. We are airing live here on the Lilydale Assembly official Facebook page and the YouTube channel. I am a year-round resident here at Lilydale and the president of the Church of the Living Spirit, which is an independent spiritualist church here in Lilydale. I'm a military veteran, retired police detective, fitness and yoga instructor, and wellness is my passion. My show is a combination of my many life experiences that will feature various topics and guests to help enrich one's mind, body, and soul on your pathway to healthy living. My Facebook page is Wellness with Nancy Lombardo, where my motto is protecting and serving your well-being. And I'm so excited to introduce our special guest this evening, Robert Ginsberg, where our topic is grief, loss, and healing. Bob Ginsberg started researching the evidence of the continuity of life after his daughter died in 2002. In 2003, Bob and his wife, Fran, who sadly passed in 2020, founded the Forever Family Foundation, a global not-for-profit that seeks to blur the lines between science and spirituality with its focus that we do indeed survive physical death. Bob hosts the Signs of Life radio show, has authored 2 books, The Medium Explosion and My Life Here and There. Bob also writes a blog at beyondthefivesenses.com. And the Forever Family Foundation are currently featured in the Netflix docuseries Surviving Death. And for everything else, there's www.foreverfamilyfoundation.org. And in saying that, welcome so much, Bob. I'm so glad you joined us.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. It's my pleasure to be with you tonight.
So I have a whole line of questions, but before I want to start and going into the Forever Family Foundation, I'd love for you to tell us about your life before Forever Family Foundation.
Yeah, I barely remember it. But if we were having this conversation or interview 22 years ago, I would have thought that it's woo stuff, and it's like I didn't believe in psychic ability. I didn't believe in certainly life after death, although I never gave it much thought. I mean, I was an open-minded skeptic. I wasn't closed-minded. I was open to it, but I was a left-brain materialist thinker. I thought that we were products of what we were, our brains. The brains produced consciousness. Therefore, when the brains were gone, we were gone, and nothing else could continue. Of course, many things in life are triggers to exploration. In my case, it was, the death of my daughter. And I started reading hundreds and hundreds of books, and I started to track down scientists and researchers and medical doctors that studied the mind, the brain, and consciousness, because I wanted to find out, A, if there's any credible evidence, of survival of consciousness, and B, was she okay? Did she still survive, and was she okay? And the more I started to learn, the more amazed that I got. Of course, I found that helpful in my grief, by learning about all those things. Although, admittedly, it took about 7 years before I relented. I fought everything. I mean, every sign, every communication, medium readings. I couldn't really buy in until eventually I had to succumb to the weight of the evidence. So my life now is completely different than it was, before my daughter passed.
Well, let me ask you this:
Yeah.
before, like even as a child, did you have any experiences, feeling things or dreams or seeing people? Did you have anything like that happen to you as a kid?
I never did. I was about as unintuitive as you could get. I really did not. Although I was probably somewhat of a weird kid. I remember the one memory I do have of my childhood is I had this pervasive thought that I was the only real person on earth, and everybody around me were actors that and my family were the best actors, and they won the role of being my family. Years later, when what was that movie that came out, The Truman Show? I was going to ask for royalties, because I lived I lived that when I was a kid, But no, I never really had any intuitive experiences. My wife, on the other hand, um, was extremely intuitive and had a lot of communications. And even after my daughter passed, so I was living vicariously through her because I knew that she would never lie to me about anything. So I trusted her when she would tell me all these things. So, I paid attention.
Would you mind sharing the story about your daughter's passing?
Well, as I mentioned, there were many instances in our lives together with my life together with my wife where she would have these premonitions, visions, call it what you would, but she would know things before they happened. And it didn't happen often, but when they happened, everything always played out exactly the way she said they would, except that they were always good things. And then on the morning of September 1st, 2002, she popped up in bed at 3:30 in the morning, and she was shaking. She was trembling. And her face was completely white. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she just stared at me. And I said, "What's the matter?" And then finally she said, "Something horrible is going to happen today." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" She said, I don't know the details, but our lives are going to be changed forever today. And I took that seriously because, as I mentioned, it's not the first time she's had visions. And even though they were all good things, if she was right then, logic told me she could be right now, so I watched over our three children that day. My middle child was back at Carnegie Mellon University. She just started a college career. I was taking my son the next day back to his school. And my youngest was working a part-time job. And to make a long story short, as the day went on, I let it fade from my awareness. We were all out to dinner at a local restaurant. We had two cars. I let my son and my daughter take one of the cars home, and we followed and came upon the accident that my son and my daughter were in, and my daughter didn't survive her injuries, and my son had some very severe injuries himself. And then I was in a state of shock, obviously. At that point, I didn't know if I was going to lose two kids or one. And my son was in a coma. And eventually he did make a miraculous recovery. And when I started to emerge from the shock, and then I remembered that morning, how did Fran know? Because she knew. That's what started me on my journey, because then I became obsessed with finding out how she knew. And oddly enough, a lot of people say that, especially with children, but in adults too, they have some inner knowing that their life is not going to be long. And in retrospect, after my daughter passed, we found all these writers. She was only 15 when she passed, but she was a terrific writer. And we found these volumes of essays and stories and poetry that she wrote. And one of the poems she wrote was called "The Wonder Awaits." And it was all about when it was her time to go, how she's going to come back and let everybody know what it's like, on the other side. And when there were many, many things that I look back upon, maybe she had some knowledge her life was going to be short, and why she crammed everything that she could into her short life.
Because that's very deep for someone that age, for sure.
Yeah, it was, reading through the stuff. I mean, we used to yell at her because she was up to the wee hours in the morning. We thought she was online with her friends, but she was writing, and I had no idea. I mean, she and I both had a love for writing, and we would compare notes, but I never knew to what extent she was really writing.
Well, I'm very sorry about that incident. Then I responded to many, many accidents like that, and they were always the hardest ones for me to wrap my mind around. responding to them and thinking, the person was alive in 1 second, the next second they're not. It was just horrible. And many times when we were going to the families, they similar to your wife's, not so much like the day before, but almost the moment that it happened, they like had the sense of it, they had a sense of something going on. You saw that many, many times with people. So
Yeah, that family bond, that love bond in the family, especially between a mother and a child, um, is tangible. I mean, the sense, when something happens. So it's another form of evidence that we're more than our physical brains. That our minds can travel, and receive information from non-physical sources.
right, yeah, it's very interesting to say the least. I used to always think I know. When I saw that, it almost forced me to live with my life differently, thinking, if you would have got up that morning and know that this was going to be your last day of your life, would you have done anything different? Because I think about those kind of accidents where you're just taken so suddenly, because it could happen at any time to any one of us for sure. And so it does force you to look at things differently and ultimately live your life differently, I believe.
I totally agree with that. I mean, with the losses that I've suffered in my life, I try now to do exactly what you say. I try to live each day, as if it's the last, because you just don't know.
Mm-mm.
In a blink of an eye, everything changes.
And I can't imagine the grief you and your wife went through with such a horrible, horrible loss, and the fact that your son was so terribly injured also. But I'm wondering what it was about this grief, specifically, that took you into the direction of the foundation. Because I mean, there's many people that start different foundations for their loved ones, but yours was so specific in the direction you wanted to go.
Yeah, well, really, obviously, we were devastated. I mean, frankly, I'd go to sleep every night just hoping that I wouldn't wake up. I was like
Yeah.
pleading with the universe, let me have a heart attack and just die in my sleep. So we were looking for some outlet. So we found a support group, for bereaved parents. And I grabbed my wife and we got in the car and we drove an hour to this meeting. And every time, because by the time we went to the meeting, I was already starting to research, the consciousness and survival. And every time that I brought up in the meeting the afterlife, or another dimension that we go after we die, the moderator would shut us down. We don't talk about those things here. The purpose of this group is to teach people how to cope with their grief, and that's not for us. Which my wife and I thought it was odd, because all the parents that were in this group, that's the only thing that they wanted to talk about. Because what could give you any more hope, or comfort than believing that your loved one still survived? So we used to stand out in the parking lot in New York, sometimes in the middle of winter, after the meeting was over, and talk to all the parents about and discuss these things. And then we said, there has to be some sort of a forum where people can attend to share these things without the fear of being, labeled or judged. And so we thought that we'd form an organization where we'd have these afterlife discussion groups. And then, so that's the first thing that we did after we started. We started the foundation after meeting with various scientists, and we wanted the foundation to be like a convergence of both science and spirituality. And then we went to a couple of mediums before the foundation, and then after I took part in some research, and some of them were not very good at all, and then I said, well, so I kind of picked the brains of scientists that studied mediumship in university settings or in private research facilities. And then we developed our own certification process, under controlled conditions, as a resource for the bereaved. And then, one thing led to another. Then we started to hold annual conferences in different parts of the country. And then we started our own radio show in 2005, and we published a magazine, which we don't do anymore. And you'd hold the webinars, and now we hold 4 grief retreats per year. One of them you mentioned. You mentioned in your opening remarks, the introduction about the Netflix series, and we let them film a whole retreat that we had in Connecticut. So there's a lot, just people are interested in these things. I would say, and we have, 15,000 members now. I'd say the majority of them have suffered, the loss of a loved one. But what we're starting to find now is that there's quite a number of people my age, the baby boomers, that are starting to contemplate their own mortality for the first time in their lives and say, wait, is there anything real? Or is this fantasy or blind faith? And they're curious. And some of those people are joining the foundation just to find out some more information. So, it always amazes me, how much interest there is in this subject, and we just keep growing and growing.
I think I stayed interested in it when you carry a gun for 28 years. Every day, it's always in the back of your mind one way or another, whether you're coming home or not coming home. So, but people that don't carry a gun to work every day, maybe not so much. And it's to take a loss like that, and then all of a sudden you have these questions and awakenings and questions mainly. So did your intuitive self that you say is not intuitive, did your daughter, after she passed, leave you start leaving you signs or symbols, as they say?
Well, here's the thing. There were signs and synchronicities happening all around me. My wife would recognize them right away, but since it didn't fit into my frame of reference, I didn't recognize them or I ignored them. However, I was having dream visitations from my daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and I would write them all down on a legal pad when I woke up, because my wife had said that's something I should do. I'm glad she did. But over the course of 4 years, I think I counted 72 dream visitations that I had.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and these were, in a dream visitation, it's very tactile. I mean, I could hug her, I could kiss her, I could talk to her, I could smell her, I could, So, as opposed to what I call regular dreams, regular dreams tend to be very disjointed. They don't make any sense. They're all over the place. You usually it's your body's way of working out things that have happened in your life. But dream visitations are quite different. I mean, the theory being that the person in spirit now sees this conduit because your chatter mind is set aside during the certain stages of sleep, and they see a way to get through. So for some reason, I'm useful when I'm unconscious, but I have no use when I'm conscious. From the intuitive side, anyway.
She's very persistent too. 7, that's a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot, and
that's beautiful.
Yeah, I always recommend to people that they write down all their experiences they have, even medium readings, because, when grief is a roller coaster, and when you reach those low points, you can pull out your notes. Wait a second, this happened and that happened, and this happened, this is what she said. And, you kind of lift yourself out of the abyss of grief, at least, temporarily. So it's always important to write these things down. I also recommend when people get medium readings that they record them, for that reason. Well, for many reasons, but that's one of them.
Mm-hmm. So prior to your daughter passing, you never had a medium reading before?
No, as a matter of fact, I distinctly remember playing golf about 2 months before my daughter passed with my friend Kenny, and Kenny had recently lost his wife to cancer. And we're sitting in the golf cart, and Kenny turns to me and he said, "Bob, I have to tell you something." I said, "What?" He said, "I went to see a medium." And then alarm bells started going off in my head. I wasn't even quite sure what a medium was, but to me, it didn't sound right. So he says, and he started telling me she knew all of these obscure things about, his wife that she couldn't possibly have known or researched. It was stuff only he knew. And then he looked at me and he said, because he must have seen that look in my eyes that people give me now, that like glazed look. And he said, "You don't believe any of this, do you?" And I gave him some lame answer, like, "Well, Kenny, you never know." And I remember going home to my wife and saying, "You're not going to believe this. I'm so worried about Kenny. He's going to this gypsy fortune teller and she's going to take all his money. And he's so overwhelmed by his grief that, he's not rational." And I have to laugh because I look at my life now. I've spent the last 20 years, working with mediums, so it just shows you how your life can be flipped on its edge and, instantly.
For sure. That's a great story for sure. So was there a pivotal moment that changed you from me being a non-believer to a believer?
With me, it was more of an accumulation of things. As I said, since I wrote all this stuff down, there was one point where somebody had asked me to give them some material for a book, and I was forced to take out all my notes. And I used to write down all these extraordinary experiences. And just to show you where my head was at, I had 20 extraordinary experiences that happened. And I went to a statistician, a professional statistician with a PhD, and I asked them to calculate the odds against chance of each one of these things happening. And when she came back and told me that I had 20 occurrences, each with odds against chance of exceeding 1,000,000 to 1, that's when I backed off and said, "Wait a second, you have to follow the evidence. That's statistically impossible." So there were certain things that were extraordinary, but I think it was the weight of everything in totality that really was the turning point for me. I had many moments that were individual, turning points, but I would do my own experiments. I did a remote viewing experiment that was really impactful, where I had people. I had read everything that I could on the subject of remote viewing, and as you probably know, remote viewers can send their consciousness, for lack of a better term, to a distant target.
Yes.
And actually visit that target. Now, our own CIA hired remote viewers in the now declassified Stargate program. And they would just give latitude and longitude to these people during the Cold War with Russia, and they would draw pictures of military sites. So I devised an experiment where I just told everybody that I was going to draw a picture at a certain hour of every day for 5 consecutive days. And at the end, I asked everybody to physically mail in. This was back in 2005, to mail in their set of drawings. And they got a good response, and they all started coming in. And I started opening them, and it wasn't anything significant. It would be a stretch. And I thought, well, that's a failure. And the very last envelope that came in was from a woman in Oregon, who I opened up the envelope. First, I thought my wife was playing tricks on me because I opened up the sealed envelope and she drew 3 of my pictures exactly the way I drew them. To the point where one day I said, "I'm not going to draw a picture. I'm going to draw a geometric shape." And I drew a dot with concentric circles around it.
Mm-hmm.
And she nailed it. And the interesting thing was I drew that geometric shape on Friday, but she drew it on Wednesday, which raised the question of who was remote viewing who, So, and what I learned in remote viewing, time and spaces and distances as we know it doesn't mean anything in the non-physical world, dimension. So it's very likely that, time was irrelevant, in that process.
Well, Amy Checkin, one of the founders of our church here, that's one of her favorite things to say. We are many places at one time. So she loves that. We're always spinning and always at different places and all at one time. So yeah, remote viewing. I've taken some classes on it, and it's it's very important, especially with the mediums that are working missing cases or missing children or unsolved crimes. They use that quite often. So it's a very good tool for sure. I love that.
Yeah.
So, why did you feel it was important to incorporate scientists into your study with the foundation?
Well, well, it's important, the scientists that study the things that we study, such as near-death experiences, reincarnation, deathbed visions, mediumship, after-death communications. They've all been stigmatized by their peers. It's very, very, the mainstream science only recognizes things that they can dissect and explain in physical terms. So they were taking a big risk, but the evidence, not only in life after death, but in telepathy and intuition and presentiment and all these things is overwhelming. So in order for you to believe in life after physical death, you first have to believe that your mind or your soul or your consciousness, whatever you want to call the essence of who we are, extends and can act independently of the physical brain. And you see that in things like distant healing or psychokinesis or remote viewing, because once you believe that our mind is not the same as our brain, then when the brain is gone, it's not illogical to believe that our consciousness still is. So you needed science to lend credibility to that. And also with dealing with a subject with mediums, mediums, there are still people that think like I thought 22 years ago, the mediums were all frauds. So mediumship, in fact, has been studied and by prominent researchers, and many have found to be, credible. I state in the Medium Explosion book that, in my opinion, only 10 to 15% of the practitioners out there today can actually do what they claim. I'm not suggesting that the rest of them are fraudulent. They have intuitive ability, as do we all, in varying degrees, but just not at the level where they can consistently communicate with a discarnate energy. So I think it's important for the whole field as a whole, to have, like in our foundation, we have a scientific advisory board. We have an academic advisory board. We also have a medium advisory board. And we would never, every time we held a conference, or a special event, we'd always have mediums and scientists working together, which they were not used to, but I thought it was,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. It's a different concept for sure. And I can imagine that. Well, I know here at Lilydale, we have a 2-year program where our mediums go through a testing process to be able to become registered mediums, which they don't all pass the first time. But you do have to be a registered medium to be able to do readings here in Lilydale. I know you have a medium evaluation certification program. Can you tell me what that entails?
Yeah, I mean, when we first started it in 2005, we used to have it in a physical location. Matter of fact, for the first one, I rented a ballroom in a hotel in Long Island. Of course, it was not the most convenient thing because we had to put up partitions, where a sitter would sit behind the partition. And it was a bit chaotic, plus the fact that the mediums and the sitters had to travel, to that location. Over the years, it changed where we do everything now on meeting software like Zoom. But it's an extensive process. Before the mediums ever get to the point of being evaluated under controlled conditions, there's a very extensive application, series of initial questions, interviews, and so forth. And then during the process itself, they have to do readings for 5 different trained sitters that we train in how to score the information. And there are 5 different scoring methods, and they have to reach the minimum proficiency guidelines in each of the 5 things to gain certification. So we've been doing it since 2005,
Wow.
and since then we have 27 mediums have gained certification. So if you do the math, it's a little more than 1 per year. So it's a difficult process. Nothing's foolproof, but what we found is that the mediums that have gained certification have been more consistent than others, and more accurate.
Because it's you base evidence based.
It's all evidence based,
Yes.
and unfortunately, I say unfortunately because we do it as a resource for the bereaved. But the fact is that many of the mediums that we've certified have gone on to become famous, and when they become famous, what happens? They do fewer and fewer readings. They charge a lot of money, and their waiting lists that are years long. That doesn't do people that are in grief much good, So we're always trying to identify more mediums who have accessibility or who are proficient and don't charge a ton of money. So we're always on the search for that.
Because I know your retreats are all free, correct?
Well, the retreats we have to charge for because we have to pay all the venues. So we hold the retreats at our cost, for the hotel and the meals and everything else. But the mediums and the scientists and all the presenters volunteer.
Yeah, I guess that's what I meant.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, nobody from the foundation has ever been paid since the beginning. We're 100% all volunteer.
Yeah, I love that.
So there are certain things, obviously, that we have to charge. We don't charge to be a member either. People can become a member for free and right on the website. So it's been a journey. That's for
How
sure.
did you discover the use of mediumship helped with grief?
Well, I know that my wife and I visited a couple of mediums. I mean, she dragged me because I didn't really believe in them, but before the foundation, there was one medium, a well-known medium that we went to, and she gave me 3 really obscure things that she could not have possibly known, which really shook me to my core because I drove home from New York City to our house in Long Island, and the whole way I'm scratching my head. And, so what's the matter? So I have to figure out the trick. There's got to be a trick, and there was no trick. So that opened me up to the possibility that, this stuff was real. Then, I befriended scientists that work with research mediums, and I started taking part in some research and learned more and more. And then I started reading, there have been these scientific studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals showing that people who believe in an afterlife do better in their grief than those who don't. And that makes perfect sense to me, right? Because that would give you, some hope where there was none. And then, when we started having these functions and the retreats, we see people, they come on Friday, and some people are in such deep grief that you could barely engage them in conversation. Certainly you're never going to get a smile. And then by the time Sunday night comes, those same people, we're joking, there's a lightness, they leave in much better shape than when they came. Of course, the problem is, can they sustain it, because you're on a high after, that weekend, and we do everything that we can to help them in that goal. But mediumship, a really profound evidential medium reading has the power to change the way people think about death and live their lives with more meaning and purpose. The reason we take it so seriously is it's a big responsibility for a medium. It's not something you should be very cavalier about going into because you want to be famous like so-and-so on TV. I mean, you're working with people that are in bad shape. And a terrible medium reading can have the opposite effect. You could have people walk away saying, "Oh, this is all just a crock. We don't, there's nothing to this," and then they leave in worse shape than when they came. So we're always looking to elevate the mediums that really can, do what they claim to do.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, listening to you, I firmly believe what we do here at Lily Dell and what you're doing with your foundation, it's very, very similar. We have many people come here during the season also, and we have outdoor services. And I've heard many people, they sit there with their arms crossed and they're not believing a word of it until that medium tells them something they could have never known. And, they stand up and they walk out thinking, wow, there's something to this. You do have to present that evidence to them, that one fact that they just could have never known. And it makes them very quickly a believer, very quickly a believer.
Yeah, I always thought that, there's a progression. If you ask people who today in the general population, how many believe in life after death, you'd get 50, 60, maybe even 70% of people saying that they do. But what they're really saying is that they hope there is. They haven't really seen any evidence, but they hope. And then some people, they learn about some of these things. They watch some of these shows. Maybe they had a medium reading. They learn about the evidence, and that hope turns into belief. And then with some people, that belief turns into a knowing. When they reach that knowing stage, all doubt is gone. There's just something they're part of them, and they can reach that knowing stage through a significant, life-changing personal experience, or through a profound medium reading, or through the science, where they just can't refute the evidence. For me, the science opened me up to the spiritual side of things. The science told me it was real, and then I started recognizing all the signs of communication.
I think your left brain needed it that way.
Yeah, that's the way I needed it. But
to make it all make sense. So yeah,
right.
That totally makes sense. I like the way the Netflix docuseries showed the real life readings and how it's actually done compared to some of these series, the way they're so chopped up and, oh, the medium gets every single thing right. And that's not, that's just not the case.
No, you're right. And I have a problem with some of the medium shows, because it makes an impossible situation for the rest of the good mediums, because
yes, totally.
I mean, I once, there was a popular medium show, and I once had somebody say to me they had a reading with one of our mediums, and they weren't really happy. I said, why? He said, well, she got something wrong. And I said, well, even the best mediums in the world are 90% accurate. No medium's 100%. And they go, oh yes, so-and-so on TV never gets anything wrong. I said, this is television. I said, do you think it's highly edited? They're going to shoot 10 hours, for 30 minutes of content. You think they're going to show you the misses or the hits? So it's an impossible standard, that it's a misrepresentation of the craft.
Impossible standards. You're right. Yeah. So you and Fran put so much effort into all this work you did and with the retreats. How did it help both of you all dealing with your own grief?
Well, most people are, even in spouse partner situations, are very different, and people grieve differently. My wife never really needed anything because she knew not that she wasn't profoundly grieving, but she just had this inner knowledge that there was more than this physical world, and that helped her. And she kind of helped me to drag me through it. I just kept fighting it. But the more that, that I would read, such a thing as bibliotherapy, if you read stuff about the afterlife, it makes you feel better. I feel better reading, just kept reading and reading. So there's no doubt, and working with scientists that I thought were credible, they were well credentialed, from the top schools, MDs, PhDs, and for them to believe in all this, that helped me a lot. If they're believing it, that's where the evidence pointed. Um, it worked. A lot of people say to me, um, after my wife passed, wow, what was what was the difference? Like when your daughter passed and when your wife passed. And then, I mean, grief is grief. I mean, you lose a part of yourself, and there's no getting around that. The difference after my wife passed is that I now have this knowledge, that she's in a different place. Whereas when my daughter passed, I didn't believe in that. So it's different. It's still tremendously, sad, but it's not quite the same. I don't go to sleep wishing that I'm not going to wake up, whereas I did 20 years ago.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's I think that, and also I have no fear of death. I used to be paralyzed of the thought of being extinguished forever. And, even in my 20s, I remember that the thought of that was horrifying, and now um, I have absolutely no fear of it. So.
Our speaker touched base on that in church this morning, how many people are walking around this world fear-based, for sure. Um, and people need to also understand, and just like you were saying, you can believe in the continuity of life and communicate with the other side of life, but it doesn't negate the physical loss of that person. Just doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. It just gives you, as I was saying before, it just gives you a way to help you, dig out, when you reach those low points, because you go through in your head, wait, this happened, that happened, I know this is, so I it's different when you have some way. Look, there are people that I've encountered them for the past 20 years, that what happens is that they lose a loved one and the grief becomes who they are. They become defined by their grief.
Yes.
And for those people, the suggestion to them that their loved one still exists in some form, they find that hurtful, because in their mind, it's diminishing the depth of their loss. How dare you suggest they're dead? And those people, it's very, very difficult to get them to open up to some of these things that we're talking about, and that's unfortunate. But those that are at least willing to remain open-minded eventually find greater peace in their life.
So you've been through some very hard losses, for sure, in your life. What would you say is a very important first step to take towards healing?
Well, I think that you have to come to the recognition that everything is temporary. I mean, we live under this illusion of permanence, and it's instilled upon us. This planet is going to be here forever. This house is going to be here forever. My loved ones are going to be here forever, and then they're not. And if you come to learn that this is the only place, this physical place, that is temporary. Our true home, our true nature is elsewhere. It's ironic that what we think is the permanent place is the temporary place. And if you can live with that knowledge or that knowing, it can help you. So, I would say, from a practical point of view, though, when somebody has a grief, I would say, immediately start reading. There's a lot of resources. I mean, we have a recommended reading site on our website, by category. Start reading what others have written, learn everything that you can, find a qualified, medium, to go to. And that's an easy thing to say. There's not a lot of places, because your friend had a good reading with a medium doesn't mean that you're going to have the same experience. There's a lot of factors that come into play, but recommendations are a good place to start. So I think that instead of shutting yourself off, opening yourself up to learning and exploring as you search for meaning is helpful.
Oh yeah, totally. Do research for sure. Absolutely. Well, I have one last question for you. In your 20 years of all your awakening, what is the most important thing you've learned on this journey?
Well, it's pretty much what I said before. I mean, live every day like it's your last. I mean, what that forces you to do is to listen when people speak and say the things that you have to say, that instead of waiting, because it reaches a point where it's too late to say them, or at least in our physical world. So once you're able to do that and recognize that everything, changes in the blink of an eye, you can live your life more fully. You can appreciate it. And how many things, I spend my time now early in the morning, watching the sunrise, on the deck. That's my entertainment, and I can appreciate it. And I listen to all the sounds. Growing up in Brooklyn, that wasn't happening. Or in my whole, business life, there's never any time to, as they say, to smell the roses, So there's a lot of meaningful stuff that we miss. We mentioned before. We were talking before the show. I had my home destroyed in Hurricane Ian, and oddly enough, and I tend to stress over a lot of things. I was perfectly. I wouldn't say perfectly. It's upsetting. You're losing all your belongings, but I was calm throughout the whole thing. And people say, "How could you remain calm?" Because this is not loss. You want to know loss? I'll tell you about loss. This is just material stuff,
Yes.
that can be replaced. I mean, I would gladly give everything that I have ever owned for one more day with my loved one, So when you have that luxury, somehow traumatic loss, it sounds ridiculous to say it, but it gives you the advantage of perspective. You know what's truly meaningful and what's not.
I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that for sure. And you definitely have that beautiful ocean behind you when you're out in the mornings. Huh?
Yeah, well, I live on an island, so I'm surrounded by water. No,
Right.
under normal circumstances, it's a good thing.
Well, Bob, you've just been lovely to talk to. I appreciate your candidness. I appreciate you being here this evening. If anybody has any comments, they can put them in the comments and we can go back and look and answer any questions you might have. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Bob. And thank you all for being here. Please join me again in 2 weeks for my next episode of Enlightening Your Way. Please visit this page often for everything that's happening here in Lilydale. And this is the official Lilydale Assembly Facebook page. Our season's coming up very quickly, starting in June. So there's a lot going on here, so make sure you check it out. My name is Nancy Lombardo. I am protecting and serving your well-being. Please check out my page, Wellness with Nancy Lombardo, and my Instagram, nancy.k.lombardo. Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you all so very much. Good evening.
Thank you.